bit of constraints in the 80s when technology was very limited, people were battling constraints, and they would find ways to do more with less, which kind of whetted the creative mind. People really had to find ways to get out of trouble. Now it appears that in the big consoles at least you can do pretty much anything, so what they do is more of it. And games are just bigger and not necessarily different. I think Jonathan, in his own work and the work of others that I've shown this morning, you show people who deliberately set themselves constraints so they have interesting problems to fight against. This is an idea for really anyone who has a problem.
Yeah, I want to hit that one briefly. I think there actually are a lot of constraints. Like, people optimize the crap out of those games on high-end consoles, and they still have to cut half the features, right? It's just that they don't necessarily enter into it being mindful of the constraints and being creative. It's just more like they want to make a game that's like these other games, you know. But I want to hit that story thing because there's actually an interesting point about that, right? So you pick like LucasArts Adventures as an example of a narrative that's also a game. I think adventure games are a canonical example of a disharmonious construction, right? So on the one hand, you have a story, and as a user who bought this game, you want to see what happens next in the story and get to the end. That's one of the driving forces, right? But on the other hand, it's an adventure game. Adventure games are about preventing you from progressing forward until you figure out the solutions to little conundra, right? So you've got this thing that's trying to propel you forward, and you've got this thing that's trying to hold you back, right? And if you get held back because you can't figure out the puzzles, then you're frustrated because you don't find out what happened with the story, right? So it either wants to be a story or a puzzle game, but it can't really be both effectively and be a good work that way, right? So unless you find something interesting in that tension. Well, so and that's maybe possible, right? But I think the game industry has been trying to address this, but they've been doing a very bad job. So over the years, what we've been getting, not just in adventure games, but in all games, we have these story-based games like Gears of War and stuff, which are...
That doesn't have a story.
Somebody thought of it as a story, right? Yeah. And you're supposed to be able to progress and reach the end. And what that means is that the game cannot actually have difficulty, right? Because difficulty stops you from proceeding. So games like, Gears of War, or maybe Gears of War not so much, because it actually has some actual difficulty, but a lot of games now coming out are just made to make you feel like you're overcoming difficulties and persevering and being victorious, but you're not actually. It's just letting you win, right? So that you can get to the next point. And it's about making you feel like you won. And that actually feeds back into my unethical game design thing. I don't think that's quite as unethical as like World of Warcraft, but I think it's pretty bad. Like, you're lying to your customers, and you're kind of cultivating the psychology in which they enjoy being lied to. So I think, now this is a weird thing for me to say, that this is a really bad way to design games, because 99% of games fit that description that I just gave. They have narrative, and the prime way of giving the player achievement is by holding them back for a bit and then letting them go, right? And in my mind, if games are going to become a great form in the future, they have to figure out some way to solve this problem. This is one of the deep problems of game design right now that I don't think anyone talks about.
Can I just ask, how do you reconcile that with Braid? Because for me, watching you play Braid earlier, the scene where you fall down a hole and you have the key. Yeah. How is that different? How do you view that as being different?
Well, if you don't figure it out, so there's two things about Braid. One is that it's a puzzle game, but it's designed to be non-linear. I didn't talk about this, but you can once you've gotten to a certain point in the game, you don't. Strike what I just said. In that sense, the game is orchestrated such that as you progress, you only have to walk to a new level to gain access to the puzzles, but each puzzle does not firewall you from the next one. You have random access to them, and you can figure them out in any order that you want, right? So there's still kind of a feeling of progress as you make it to new worlds, but the real feeling of progress comes from solving those individual puzzles. Now, that key in the pit is the one puzzle in the entire game where you cannot proceed in the game without solving it, right? It keeps you, and that kind of goes. I was modeling that frustration and enlightenment thing. Like, a lot of players my publisher is actually pressuring me to change this puzzle, right? You fall in the pit and you're like, man, I have no idea what to do, you know? But I wanted that to be that way. I wanted like real difficulty and an actual realization, and not the game giving you a hint like, oh, I see you can't figure out how to get out of the pit. Clippy will come along and say, you know, press the rewind button. You know, there's a difference between those two things, and I feel like it's an important difference.
I understand the difference, but
Yeah.
do you think that perhaps that's what games are in some level? Like, do you think that the experience... I understand your intent there, but do you think that the experience that people have... Sorry for hijacking your question, by the way.
There's a good question.
But do you think that perhaps that's what people want out of a game, though, rather than it being about what we are imposing on them? Do you think people actually do enjoy that experience, even if it is, and I'm not sure that it really is, artificial?
So I have a weird analogy that's coming up, and it's not going to play that well in Australia because you guys don't have iPhones here, right?
No, we do know what they are, though.
Oh, you know what they are, but you can't buy one yet, right? So, you know, cell phones, or mobile phones, as you may call them, have been pretty horrible for a long time. Like, they don't do messaging very well. The voicemail is, like, very frustrating and things like that. But if you took a focus group of, like, what people wanted in a phone and you know, asked them, like, hey, phones are frustrating. What do you really want? And you took all of what they want and put that together, you would never get the iPhone, right? You would get something kind of like a Nokia whatever, but maybe slightly better.
So it's
right?
like...
So the iPhone is more like, we're going to create something that is really what would be good for people, not necessarily what they're telling us that they want, because they don't necessarily know exactly what they want, right? They can voice their frustrations maybe in certain ways, but they're not, you know, to cross metaphors again, gamers are not game designers, right? So they can't necessarily tell you what they do want, right? So you kind of have to read between those lines, right? And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with Braid, and whether it'll be successful or not, I don't know. But I'm taking a very unconventional structure that is not like what gamers are used to and not like what they say they want, but saying, if I give this to you, I think you may enjoy it, right? And maybe this will be the mold for a different type of game.
This will be your iPhone.
This will be my iPhone, yes. But it's cheaper. It's a lot cheaper.
That's good.
Thank you.
They have a lot of fun to play with this one.
Another question somewhere? Right at the back, last row.
I just want to ask about your aversion to the ludology term. Just on some text, like what you think of like the rules of play text or anything like that, just in the way they're kind of trying to hammer that home.
So Eric and Katie are friends of mine.
Yeah.
I just live in New York, and I hang out with them, and I see them once in a while. Man, I couldn't get past the first 10 pages of that book. Like, seriously, because it to me, it's not really getting at the truth of what's behind games. And I don't know how else to describe it. It just seems like they wanted to have a party and be all academic and talk about things, but I don't get the deep understanding out of that book that I want. You know, Ralph Koster's book, I think, which is a lot more plain-spoken. It has little cartoon doodles like in the sides, and not to be anti-intellectual, but I think that's a much better book to give to people if they want to understand what games are about than rules of play. Rules of play is something that you give to someone who is thinking about teaching a game design course, right? And needs to learn how to elevate their language to the point where nobody can understand what they're saying so that people will take them seriously. And I say that fully, like, Eric Zimmerman's a friend of mine, man, but man, that book.
I think the important thing with any of this stuff is just to kind of be aware of it. You perhaps might not have to subscribe to all of its tenets. You might not have to be like a card-carrying ludologist. But if you're kind of aware of it, I mean, again, it can just work on your subconscious. You can be aware of other people's ideas, and perhaps they might influence you, perhaps they might not, but you're at least aware of work and framework and references and things like that. You might choose to ignore it, but at least you know what you're ignoring, I think.
For those of you who don't know ludology, it comes down to a basic argument that was at the beginning of ludology, kind of as a movement, where someone said, if someone throws a ball at me and I catch it, I don't expect the ball to start telling me stories, and that's the big analogy. And my response to that has been, well, true, but I always expect to be able to tell a story myself about the day I was playing ball. Like, there's got to be something, there's got to be driving force. And I do agree with Jonathan that, I mean, it's my job to know those books, and some of them just don't. There's just a not getting it at the centre of them. Some of them have got some great elements to bring out, but there's just no passion.
I really want to make that point that some of them do actually have some ways of thinking about games and gameplay